Okay, so you're here to get a handle on what was up with XRP, and we're going to skip right over all this complicated charts and get straight to the stuff that matters.
Yeah.
This is a deep dive into XRP from a technical standpoint, specifically from March 29th, 2025.
Yeah, we're going to zero in on how XRP was moving on that day and unpack how those who follow it closely were looking at the data.
All right, cool. So starting with the basics, on March 29th, 2025, XRP was sitting around that $2.18 mark.
Right.
It had actually just dipped a little bit, about 0.2% over the 6 hours before that. And we were seeing recent highs of 2.12 and a recent low of 2.1 cent, and the volume was moderate. So what does all that tell us right off the bat?
Well, the thing that jumps out is that little dip, because it suggests that the upward momentum XRP had been, well, it's sort of stalled out. So we're in what's called a consolidation phase.
Consolidation phase.
Yeah. Basically, the price is taking a break after some, movement.
Like catching its breath.
Exactly.
So when it's in this holding pattern,
Uh-huh.
there are certain price levels that become really key, right?
Definitely.
And we're talking about support and resistance.
Absolutely. Those are the big ones.
Okay, so break those down for us.
So support is like a price floor. It's where buyers are more likely to come in. And the analysis was showing immediate support just around that 2.16C low.
Okay.
And then a little bit further down, there was an even stronger support zone between $2 and 2.0.
So those are the floors. What about the ceilings? What was XRP bumping up against?
Right. Well, the first hurdle was obviously that recent high of 2.19, but even more interesting was that 2.3 level.
Okay.
That was seen as a key resistance point for a couple of reasons. First, you've got that psychological aspect. Round numbers often make sellers hesitant.
Right.
And second, it also happened to line up with the 50-day moving average, at least on some of the shorter-term charts.
Gotcha.
So that really cemented it as a potential barrier.
Okay, so beyond the actual price itself, were there any technical indicators giving us clues about, the overall market sentiment?
Well, yeah, that slight dip in price was a hint that there was some selling pressure in the short term, but then you look at the volume being just moderate, and it kind of balances things out.
Yeah.
It's not super strong buying, but it's not a sell-off either.
Right, so it's like the market's just waiting to see what happens next.
Exactly, waiting for a clearer signal. And, if we saw like a breakout above that resistance level with strong volume, that would be a sign that buyers are really feeling confident.
That makes sense. So with those levels and indicators in mind, what were the most likely scenarios that people were looking at for XRP that day?
Well, there were basically two main paths people were considering.
Okay.
So the bullish scenario, let's say XRP breaks above that 2.19 resistance. Well, then the next targets would be somewhere between 2.25 and 2.3 year.
Got it.
But on the flip side, the bearish scenario, if it drops below 2.16, then we might see it testing that 2.1 support level.
Okay, so let's say someone is actually looking at all this analysis, trying to figure out, if they should make a trade, what kind of strategies were people talking about?
Right. Well, a more conservative approach would be to look for entry points near that support level, maybe between 2.16 and 2.17.
Okay.
And then you'd want to set a stop loss just below the recent low. So around 2.14, that's your safety net in case things go south.
Right.
And for taking profit, you target that 2.19 resistance first, and then potentially 2.25 after that.
So that's more of a play it safe kind of approach.
Exactly.
What if you're feeling a little bit more, adventurous?
Well, in that case, you might try a more aggressive strategy where you wait for a clear break above 2.192, and ideally you want to see increased volume with that break. Your stop loss would be tighter, maybe around 2.17, and your profit targets would be higher, aiming for that 2.25 to 2.3 zone.
So more risk, more potential reward.
Right, exactly. But no matter what your strategy is, there's one piece of advice that's absolutely crucial.
What's that?
Risk management. You never want to risk more than a small percentage of your capital on any single trade, usually around 1-2%.
Yeah, that's solid advice.
And of course, always keep an eye on the bigger market picture and any news that could impact XRP's price.
For sure, and it's interesting because we saw some similar points being made in this Google podcast script source from around that same time.
Oh, really?
Yeah, their numbers were a little bit rounded, so they had XRP at about 2.18 support, at 2.15 resistance, at 2.19, but basically the entry and target levels were pretty much the same.
Well, it's nice to see that different analyses were coming to similar conclusions.
Yeah, it really underscores how significant those technical levels were for analysts back then.
Absolutely.
So just to wrap things up, this deep dive has given you a solid understanding of XRP's technical landscape on March 29th, 2025.
Right.
We've covered those key price levels, the potential ups and downs that were being considered, and the different trading strategies that were on the table.
And, it's fascinating to think about how this kind of technical analysis tries to predict future price movements by looking at past behavior and current data. But it begs the question, beyond those support and resistance levels, what other factors, maybe less obvious ones, could really shape XRP's long-term path,
Right.
beyond just these technical signals?
Yeah, that's something worth thinking about for sure.
Absolutely.
All right, well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into XRP, and we'll catch you next time.
See you then.